So I want to introduce the panel moderator. It's my friend Karthik Ramakrishnan. Karthik is an Associate Dean of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy and Professor of Public Policy and Political Science. He is also a board member of the California Endowment and a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He received his PhD in politics from Princeton University and has held fellowships at the Russell Sage Foundation, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Public Policy Institute of California. Karthik's research focuses on civic participation, immigration policy, and the politics of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States. He directs the National Asian American Survey and is founder of aapidata.com. Go look it up, it's a great site. So I'm going to turn it over to Karthik, and he's going to manage this really big panel, and I'm glad he's moderating and not me. So thank you, Karthik.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, it looks like I have to hold this down. So first, I should note that the optics look pretty bad here in terms of gender diversity on this panel, so I want to put that out there. And Brad and I talked about it, and I mean, the conference itself has a lot more gender diversity than what we have here. Brad, I think, went through a list of like 20 people who, for various reasons, not to say that we're like sloppy seconds here, but that said, in addition to, but in addition to, oh, I didn't mean to, but, okay. But in addition to, I'm already digging myself in a hole, kind of. Trying to do good here, but but in addition to the commentary here, Ana Sampaio is someone that we'd like to hear from as well. This was arranged in advance, but we don't quite know yet what she's going to start off her lead commentary from the floor, but we welcome that as well. I'm just going to say a bit about each of these folks. They have very illustrious careers and bios, but in the interest of time, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. And then the format is going to be about 4 minutes of commentary each. I'm just going to like wave my hand when it's like, when it's close to time, if anyone's running over. And then I have a set of theme questions to throw out to the panel with some lead folks that are going to offer some initial remarks and others chiming in. And then we'll open up to the floor with Ana providing the first set of remarks. Okay, so first, to my left, none of these folks are ideologically placed. At least I don't think they are. We may discover things. Yeah, with Kevin, we don't know if he's to the extreme right or the extreme left, depending on the perspective, I suppose. I jest. And most of the, well, we'll see what comes out of today. So first we have Dean Kevin Johnson. He is and I apologize for if I butcher any of these names, maybe Apollos, is that right? Professor of Public Interest Law and Professor of Chicano Studies at UC Davis School of Law. He joined the UC Davis faculty in 1989 and was named Associate Dean in 1998, subsequently became Dean in 2008. He's published extensively on immigration law and civil rights. His book, How Did You Get to Be Mexican? A White Brown Man's Search for Identity, was nominated for the 2000 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. His latest book, Immigration Law on the U.S.-Mexico Border, received the Latino Literacy Now's International Latino Book Awards Best Reference Book. Magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where he served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. He has a bunch of other things, but in the interest of time, Dean Kevin Johnson. To his left is Philip Martin. Philip Martin received as professor of agriculture and resource economics at UC Davis. He received his degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1975. His research focuses on immigration, farm labor, and economic development. Martin is chair of the University of California's Comparative Immigration and Integration Program and editor of the monthly Migration News and the quarterly Rural Migration News. And he's published extensively on topics related to immigration, especially the rural aspect. He was a member of the binational study of migration between 1995 and 1997. And in 2001-2002, he assessed the options for dealing with unauthorized migration into Thailand. Next, we have Giovanni Perry from UC Davis, Department of Economics. Giovanni's professor of economics and chair of the department here at UC Davis, and he's also the director of the Migration Research Cluster. He has published extensively in academic journals and books about the economic determinants and effects of human migrations. He received grants from the MacArthur Foundation, Russell Sage, the World Bank, and the National Science Foundation, and several other institutions. Giovanni's research is often featured on The Economist, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other newspapers and blogs. After that, we have Ali Noorani from the National Immigration Forum. So Ali is the executive director of the Forum, an advocacy organization promoting the value of immigrants and immigration. Growing up in California as the son of Pakistani immigrants, Ali quickly learned how to forge alliances among people of wide-ranging backgrounds, a skill that has served him extraordinarily well as one of the nation's most innovative coalition builders, especially at the national level. Before joining the Forum, Ali was executive director of MIRA, the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, where he served in leadership roles within public health and environmental organizations. Next, we have Celeste. Celeste Montoya is a political scientist and associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. She teaches in women and gender studies and directs a program for students who are first-generation college students and or members of underrepresented minorities, a majority of whom are Latino. Her research expertise is on the politics of gender and race and often emphasizes the importance of intersectionality in social movements and public policy. Celeste has published on gender violence and immigrant mobilization, and will talk about the intersection between immigration and other issues. Finally, last but certainly not least, is Stephen Nuno from Northern Arizona University. He's an associate professor there in the Department of Political Science, and he studies political behavior, race and ethnic politics, Latino politics, mobilization, and partisanship. He's a research associate at the Levy Center for the Study of LA at Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles. He's also a regular contributor for NBC News Latino, and engages in a fair amount of public intellectual and social media work related to Latinos and immigration. So first, please give a warm welcome to all of our speakers here. And we will start off with Dean Johnson.
Thanks. Very much. The whole time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Get a bit of a workout on your track.
That's an odd microphone. I want to talk a little bit about the executive orders, the two that were issued earlier in the week. I understand that there's a third one that was just issued today, and I haven't had a chance to digest that one yet. Although I think the first two tell you a great deal about what President Trump has in mind when it comes to immigration enforcement. And I guess, but before I get there, I just want to say that I think with this administration, it'll be very much the same as the last administration in important ways. One of our speakers today at the law school is Justice Tino Cuellar from the California Supreme Court, and he advised President Obama on immigration and immigrant integration issues as well as criminal justice issues. And we worked together in the 2008 campaign on immigration policy. One of the things Justice Citizen Cuellar told me at the time was that the only way that the Obama administration is going to do anything when it comes to immigration reform or anything positive on immigration is that there's continued political activism in pushing the administration to do the right thing. And I think that we're certainly going to be in that very same situation when it comes to the Trump administration. It'll be more important than ever to be involved politically as this process unfolds. And I guess it started unfolding earlier this week with the two executive orders. In these two executive orders, I want to focus on sort of some big picture issues that some of it's getting a little attention, some of it's getting a lot less attention. I'm not going to talk about the wall, although I have serious concerns about whether the wall will be help enforcement and whether it will do anything other than result in more deaths along the border. I'm not going to talk much about that because I think in some ways it's symbolic of what the administration wants to do in immigration. But I will talk about the focus and the building on the Obama administration structures on criminal-based removals. And the Obama administration was focused primarily for the first term on crime-based removals, had sort of perfected a program called Secure Communities that facilitated the removal of record numbers of non-citizens, including lawful permanent residents from the United States, some for relatively minor crimes. Actually, you look at some of the research, it shows that many for relatively minor crimes. If I had more than 4 minutes, I'd tell you about some of the cases the Obama administration took to the Supreme Court that were very minor crimes that a somewhat conservative Supreme Court found went way too far. But what the Trump administration is trying to do is they eliminated a most recent liberalization by the Obama administration in its criminal justice enforcement. There's a priority enforcement program that was adopted in November 2014 that required the local official to turn over persons convicted of serious crimes, narrowing what previously had been much broader under secure communities. We were still seeing how that was playing out under the Obama administration. One of the things done in the executive order was to dismantle the priorities enforcement program and go back to secure communities, and to broaden the definition of criminal aliens who could be subject to the removal processes of the federal government. So I think and we see a number of other places where it's clear that the Trump administration is going to try to get state and local governments to cooperate more with the federal government when it comes to immigration enforcement. One of those is the attacks on sanctuary cities. We still have to see how that's going to play out. I think, in terms of practical defunding, it's going to be relatively limited, but I tend to think that there's some cities, and Miami is one today, that said they were going to, dismantle their, sanctuary ordinance to cooperate fully with the federal government. But besides attacking sanctuary cities, there's also a comeback of what's called the 287G agreements. Those are agreements between state and local governments and the federal government to help assist in federal immigration enforcement. They had been in place and used extensively during the Bush administration, but have been largely dismantled under the Obama administration, and in no small part because there are concerns that state and local governments, and you can think about Maricopa County Sheriff's Office and Joe Arpaio, had engaged in racial profiling and violated the civil rights of large numbers of people. But one of the parts of the executive order that's not getting much attention is that the 287G agreements are going to make a comeback. So we'll see some jurisdictions, probably not that many in urban areas in California at least, looking at those kinds of agreements. The other thing I'll mention, only very briefly because I'm sure my time's up, one last thing. These sanctuary cities under one of the executive orders are supposed to report aliens who've committed crimes. They're supposed to publish these things and let the world know who these alien criminals are. This is very consistent with the Trump administration's reliance on victims of immigrant crimes in the campaign. And it's likely to sort of heighten tensions, heighten anti-immigrant sentiment, and it's not going to give a full picture of the fact that immigrants, if you look at the studies, are less prone to crime than citizens, but may have a very different picture to it. Sorry to go on so long.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. So next we have Phil.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here on a Friday afternoon. I want to just make sort of 3 points. I never studied migration. I never actually taught migration. I was an economist at the Brookings Institution in the late 1970s. And we had a person who was the director of the UCSD Center for Mexico Studies who wanted to have a guest worker program in the late 1970s in order to deal with unauthorized migration from Mexico. And there was a meeting at Senator Ted Kennedy's house, and I think I was about 27 or so at the time, and I went to debate a professor then from MIT, and the idea was that people just wanted to go back and forth. And the assertion was Mexicans are homing pigeons. They will never settle in the United States. This was at a time when there were about 1 million Mexican-born people in the United States. Well, the world has changed. Back then, we went after Ted Kennedy did not introduce the guest worker program. We had the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy, on which I worked. And we had a debate then, and we have a debate now, between restrictionists who say no migrants and admissionists who say no borders. The biggest change in my 30-some years of working on this is that back in the Select Commission days, FAIR and the U.S. Catholic Conference would be in the same room. They didn't agree, but they would be in the same room. Now they have their completely separate meetings. And what's happening in migration is kind of what happens in the other area I work on, which is farm labor. The two sides are like ships passing in the night. And what that tends to bring about is what I'm afraid we're getting in migration policy making. There's a pendulum quality. When you're in control, you push the levers as far as you can to get toward the no borders or the no migrants extreme, knowing that or fearing that it may switch back. So in the mid-1990s, after when they were tightening up the laws, that was when a whole lot of things were redefined as felonies so it would be easier to deport people. And I remember the lawyer who was writing those laws saying we have to put in as much as possible, writing that part of the law, as much as possible because the other side will eventually get in and they will try to swing it back. I think where we are now is clearly a place in which the train may have been moving in one direction toward thinking there will be comprehensive immigration reform, and now it's swinging back the other way. The big risk is, of course, taking a situation which most people, I'm sure, in the room, including myself, don't agree with, but actually making it worse rather than better. I mean, the biggest problem, I was just in Mexico, the biggest problem is that if the hotheads on both sides take over and they get into a fight about Mr. Trump's orders, walls, and all this sort of thing, there's a real risk that Mexico could lose a big part of its auto industry. And remember, Mexico's the world's 7th biggest producer of cars, the world's 4th biggest exporter, creates 600,000 or 700,000 very good jobs. I don't know how one negotiates when you have two extremes, but just as we've had a debate now for 15 years or 16 years on comprehensive immigration reform, which did not happen, I do hope that as we deal with what's now a new era in migration policy making coming out of Washington, we can avoid a situation in which we get a clash of the extremes with a whole lot of innocent people that will get trampled as they fight. I'm not sure we're clever enough to do that, but I certainly hope that we can wind up avoiding the worst case scenarios. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Phil. Quite provocative. I don't know how many no borders people existed in the prior administration, but I think it'll be a fruitful discussion to have. Okay, next we have Giovanni.
So I was given 4 minutes. I'm going to talk about 4 facts. We've learned that there are alternative facts these days, but I'm going to talk about facts. So these facts are connected or actually disconnected completely with the policy. The fact number 1, which everybody knows who has studied immigration, is that the population of undocumented has not grown in the last 10 years. So the flow of undocumented in net has stopped being positive since 2006. And in fact, the population of Mexican in the United States has decreased significantly because the returnee have been larger than the immigrants in the last year. In the last 5 years, about 150,000 people have decreased. What has happened on the border is that there have been some asylum seekers, children and women coming from Central America, which are a completely different type of population. So obviously, a wall which is thought for economic Mexican immigrant is a complete anachronism now. The second fact is that from 2001, so from the recession, from September 11, until now, the largest and fastest growing group of immigrants in the United States have been students and highly skilled. So we have not talked about this. This in UC Davis is evident, but the number of, in large part, Asian students and young professionals that have come to this country have, by large, outnumbered the number of low-skilled who have come in net. And so legislation and policy which affect that part is going to be crucial and very important. And so if you want to talk about that, and if it's going to be a very important part. The third is that neither from economists nor from statisticians there is any evidence whatsoever that deportation or a decrease of the undocumented population will create any new job for American workers. In fact, there is a big debate if there has been any effect of the inflow of immigrants on American jobs and wages, but very likely removing these people who have jobs which are different from what young Americans will do and which are in location where they're needed is not going to create jobs, but it's certainly going to put in crisis some big sectors of the American economy or will generate big changes in this, certainly in agriculture, certainly in some part of manufacturing, certainly in some part of construction. The fourth fact is that there is evidence, on the other hand, there was a lot of economic evidence that a program of legalization and documented would have created an increase in wages for these people, an increase in demand, and potentially an increase at the local level. There is this concept of local job multiplier that economists use, that when you attract one job or retain one job, other connected jobs are created, and this job multiplier was estimated to be very large for high-skilled immigrants, but also for low-skilled immigrants who are in a location. So, no net inflow of undocumented in the last 10 years, large inflow of students and highly skilled, no evidence that deportation will create any job, and evidence that a legalization would have done good. Now, compare the idea in policy which are proposed now, and tell me where the businessman, who is the current president, get his wisdom in order to enforce those.
Does he
Okay,
see
next
the
we
time?
have Ali.
Do I get the rest of Giovanni's time? No? Oh, well, it's okay, very impressive. All right, well, thank you very much for having me. As the token non-professor on the panel, I'm very honored to be here. So I live and work in Washington, D.C., where up till about 7 days ago, nothing happened. But now everything is happening clearly. So I wanted to spend a minute or two just talking about kind of the lay of the land of the state of play in D.C. So clearly, President Trump has moved forward, and he's moved forward very aggressively to fulfill his campaign promises. As the dean mentioned earlier, I think that the executive order is a lot of symbolism. What's there remains to be seen. The interior enforcement executive action from Wednesday, I think, is much more far-reaching than, frankly, even Breitbart News expected. So I think we have to really watch carefully the implications of that. I think the idea of a sanctuary city does not exist, or I'm sorry, the reality of a sanctuary city does not exist. I think that what Trump has done is actually undermined local law enforcement. He has made a terrible law enforcement decision by diminishing the trust between the cop on the corner and the immigrant in their community, that they took an oath to serve and protect. And then about an hour ago, the president was at Department of Defense and signed the executive order for, quote, extreme vetting. The language has not been released on that order yet, but as far as we can tell, it is everything that we expected in the draft that leaked earlier this week. So, kind of a tough slog ahead of us. But I think there is an opportunity in this tremendous crisis. And I'm going to be very quick, and we can talk about more of this later. With regards to DACA, with regards to the refugee program, with regards to kind of the way the country is now, it has led millions and millions of Americans to realize that their child's best friend is undocumented. The family in the pew 1 row over is undocumented. The family they really love to talk to down the street is undocumented. It doesn't matter what the president does. Millions and millions of Americans cannot unremember that. So that's our opportunity. And it's really, really hard at this moment to kind of think about that. Because we all care about this issue so deeply. But the opportunity is that millions of Americans who are born here, who've been here for generations, now know somebody who's an immigrant or who was a refugee. And we have to use this as a moment where we are advancing their understanding of this issue, because, I don't know, at our core, at my core, I don't think this is a debate about politics and policy. This is really a debate about culture and values within the country. So how do we use this moment and just fight hard and fight smart to move the needle?
Hello. So the research that I've done has focused on applying intersectionality to social movements and public policy. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with that jargon, intersectionality just looks at the ways in which different forms of oppression or identity might be interrelated to it. And so a lot of my job has been trying to make connections between issues that are sometimes treated as entirely separate from each other. A lot of that research is focused on gendered violence, and some of the stuff I'm going to talk about in relation to that research is how it connects to the immigration debate. Some of the work that I've focused on in terms of evaluating a policy that's aimed at combating violence against women or gender violence more broadly is that it has tended to leave out different groups of people. And so part of the critique against that policy is that sometimes the solutions that we give don't include all the different people and the different precarities or particularities of their situations, not providing the services that are necessary, not having shelters that are accessible, and so on and so forth. And so that's been one of the critique that's levied at that type of policy. More serious is the way in which that policy that's meant to do a good can be used to institute a harm. And so some of this is what Anna talked about a little bit earlier, in which this shift to the security state has taken policies that are aimed at helping the community and law enforcement officials that are supposed to be providing assistance in combating these issues, and that they've been implemented in really uneven and harmful ways. So in the situation of gender violence, who we think about as sympathetic victims can be colored by racism or xenophobia, so that the women that are seen as being deserving of justice don't always include women of color, immigrant women, as well as who then is targeted to be prosecuted, right? And so who is getting actually arrested and prosecuted for perpetrating gendered violence? That also becomes raced and classed. And so this has been a problem when efforts to combat violence against women really have relied on a law enforcement approach. Some of the institutionalized racism that we've seen in law enforcement has been a way in which immigrants have been used as a way to attack immigrant communities and not provide justice for those who have been victim of gendered violence. What I'm worried about now in this particular moment is that we're going to see something that goes in a very different direction. Some of my research has been on the European Union, and for those of you who have been following along in European politics, the wave of populism and xenophobia that we're seeing really manifest in our institutions right now here in the US has been happening a little bit longer in some of the European Union countries. And one of the things that happened there is they took policies that seemed really focused on women's human rights and gendered violence that started with more feminist framings about gendered violence is an issue that crosses all barriers, all socioeconomic, all cultures, and everybody deserves protection, and that we need to come up with inclusive services. And that message was co-opted and reframed to become an issue that was culturalized. And so instead, conservative forces within the European Union were able to do two things simultaneously. They were able to attack efforts to expand women's rights, and attack marginalized communities by reframing issues of gendered violence as something that those others, it's a problem of others, that it's being imported into the European Union. And in the European case, it's often targeted at Muslim communities. In the United States, we've already seen a shift in that discourse. And in the last campaign year, we've seen Trump employ that sort of thing where he uses women's rights and he uses LGBTQ rights to demonize different cultures, right? By labeling Mexicans as rapists. After the Pulse shooting, Pulse nightclub shooting, talking about LGBTQ rights, he started talking about, like, these are problems, these are not American values. We need to prevent people who have these kind of barbaric values from coming into our country. And it's a sort of a hypocritical change because we see a GOP that is looking to unravel a lot of those rights. A lot of, they've already defunded VAWA, or at least the grants that go for it. But what we're likely to see is at the same time they're attacking and taking away some of these rights, that they can also use them against immigrant groups and use them as justifications for keeping out groups of people and to target them for incarceration. And so it's this that I think think we need to be wary of, and why it's important when we're starting to have these critiques of mobilizations like the women's marches, why it's so important for those that are engaged in progressive organizing to think intersectionally and about how in moving and mobilizing on the behalf of certain rights that seem progressive, that they can be co-opted and manipulated in really exclusionary ways. And so, so this is something that I've, not only is something that I'm worried about in terms of my research, but in terms of my activism. And so some cautionaries in terms of moving forward.
Great. Finally, Stephen.
Hi. Thanks to Brad and UC Davis, the Institute for Social Sciences, for inviting me here. And so my career has taken somewhat of a detour. I came in as an academic, as a professor, and I find myself more in media, or almost equally splitting my time. So I kind of straddle these two industries, both of which are kind of reviled currently in academia and the media. And so my recent work has been in the facilitation of some communication between these two groups, right? And so academics are more concerned with, creating knowledge. They're more concerned with a very methodical kind of march towards truth. The media is less concerned with that in the sense that they're trying to get information to the public. And admittedly, there's some sensationalization to this. And oftentimes, between the two groups, there's an inability to communicate between the two. And part of what interests me in the job that I do is facilitating discussion between the two groups, because they can both help each other a lot, especially in this new era of who is in the White House. And I find myself, after the election, I was in New York, and everyone was pretty stunned, even Republicans, and when the numbers were coming in, and find myself trying to get some inspiration for what is going to happen over the next 4 years, and what we need to do. And I go back to my first class, in my first seminar at Irvine, with a man named David Easton, who is the former president of the APSR, the American Political Science Association, and he did a speech in 1969, and the title of the speech was "A New Revolution in Political Science," and he made a case for academics to, in essence, become advocates for social change. And ironically, he called for political science to lose touch with reality, and we hear some of this today, right? People are saying we have this new term called alternative facts. But it's, so it sounds ironically similar to what is going on today in the White House. But Easton had a different mission, and in his mind, he wanted us to look beyond what is real, what is going on, so that we can imagine new realities into the future that can conform or comply with our own values as a democratic society. And he said to know is to bear great responsibility for acting. And then he said something rather radical and provoked outrage even within the political science in academia. And he said politicization of the profession is inescapable as well as desirable. And this created a lot of outrage within academia, because the concept at the time was that as academics, you're necessarily only interested in the truth, not in creating social change. But he kind of started a movement of employing social scientists and political scientists to enact social change. And I think it's encouraging to see many of us up here as political scientists and as academics also coming into academia as agents of social change. And so that's what I feel my charge is, as what I do in academia, and then also in media, trying to negotiate truth with truth in many ways, right? And so there's a piece up at NBC News Latino. A couple of the folks who spoke in panels here had written something for them, and part of our mission at NBC Latino is to promote your writings, your ideas, And so I welcome also folks to contact me if you're interested and you have something to say that we could use and share with the community.
Great. Thanks, Stevens. There's a lot there, and I'm going to try to resist the temptation of asking follow-up questions to individual people, because that's what all you folks in the room are going to be doing. But I'm going to throw out certain kind of themes, especially in terms of looking ahead to the next 4 years or the next 8 years, and what we can reasonably expect to see in different ways. So first, I want to kick it off by asking Phil and Giovanni, in terms of, I mean, there's so much policy uncertainty, but given where we think things are headed, what can we expect in terms of migration flows over the next 4 years to 8 years, or say the next decade? Is this Trump presidency going to substantially alter that, especially, say, in terms of Mexican migration? Are we going to see a restart of Mexican migration, for example, if there's going to be all this economic turmoil in Mexico? Asian migration, skilled, I mean, there's a lot there. Take it in whatever direction you want. Either of you guys to kick it off.
Right now, the United States takes a little over 1 million legal immigrants a year. In addition, there are a lot of temporary visitors, like as Giovanni was saying, students, temporary farm workers. On a typical day, we have 3,100 legal immigrants. We have around 200,000 temporary visitors. And there are some unauthorized, far fewer than what there used to be, but some. And the unauthorized are increasingly those who come in legally and don't leave. Legal immigration is not likely to be reduced, so that's likely to still run at a rate of roughly 1 million a year. There's nothing in the temporary visitors categories that would necessarily say the number of tourists or business visitors, et cetera, will go down. There could be changes to the highly skilled program, since Trump says he wants to change that, but there was likely to be changes in the low-skilled program. The low-skilled programs right now, H-2A and H-2B, are issuing roughly 200,000 visas a year to Mexicans. So while unauthorized Mexico-U.S. migration has dropped, legal guest worker migration from Mexico has increased. The agricultural part of the program has roughly tripled in size in the last 10 years. If, I don't think the wall is more symbolic than anything else, but if there were to be mandatory E-Verify, and if employers were to require to recheck or re-verify their current employees, then I would expect the businessman to the business people community would put a lot of pressure for a low-skilled guest worker program of some kind, either expand the current programs or develop new ones. And what's not clear to me is whether we will move to a low-skilled guest worker program that has farm workers coming in to fill year-round jobs. Right now, the low-skilled programs normally limit the visas to 10 months. There's discussion of making them 3 years. If that were to be the case, so that you could come in with a construction visa for 3 years, or you could come in with a guest worker visa for 3 years to work in construction or restaurants, et cetera, the thing to bear in mind, at least from the point of view of farmers, right now, most low-skilled guest workers are from Mexico, but you could also have people being recruited in Asia. There are, in the Philippines, there are literally a dozen or so 747s leaving every night to take people to Saudi Arabia and other places. So there's a lot of low-skilled guest worker migration we could wind up changing. So I think Mexico is on the downside of a migration hump. Central America, on the other hand, could be on the other way. We don't know how that exactly is going to play out. But I do think we're likely to see fewer unauthorized, more guest workers if there is a big enforcement push.
Giovanni.
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things about I think that in terms of world pressure, there is going to be a continued very high pressure for highly skilled, highly educated people to come in the United States. Highly skilled job in high tech have increased in their demand, in their pay in the United States is one of the countries that pays the best, and there are middle classes in Asia that are eager to send their kids to study in the United States and to come. So I think that what happens to the H-1B visa program, for instance, which is the only one who really now let foreigner high skill to come in and eventually stay, and what is going to happen to the green cards portion that is given for job and for highly skilled is going to be very important. In terms of forces, I see demographic forces, on the other hand, working the other way for the low skill from Mexico, which already had this demographic transition and whose young cohort are smaller and smaller. But Phil is right. There are other countries, I would say maybe the Middle Eastern, North African, which are where the demographic transition is not still there. So a lot of young people, a lot of turmoil in those countries. They are potentially, some of them would be potentially refugees, and of course, this last piece of executive order reduces even further the number of refugees that the US get. So on that side, maybe policy is going to affect a lot. But the pressure for the high skilled are going to be there, and they're going to increase, and so what the US decides to do in terms of policy is going to be crucial. Just as an anecdote, very quickly, I am also the chair of economics, as it was mentioned, and we are hiring economists right now, and yesterday our top candidate for a position is an Iranian guy, and as we are getting ready to make him an offer, he cannot get a visa to come in. So of course these things are going to be affecting who we hire and what kind of university, lab, and companies we have.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I mean, I think so much has been focused on what will happen, say, with the H-1B and the DACA side, but even something just very recently in terms of targeting particular countries, it does raise the question, kind of global competitiveness of the U.S. in terms of these high-skill visas. I want to switch next to Dean Johnson. Again, it's one thing about Trump's candidacy is anyone who tried to predict anything had egg on their face or whatever else on their face. But if you had to predict the kind of legal challenges that might go somewhere in the next few years, what would you say?
That's a hard thing to say. I can say this, though. I wrote a piece in The Conversation on January 2nd that said that President Trump was going to increase crime-based enforcements in the interior of the country. So I did predict that accurately. And I think that in terms of legal challenges, I haven't read the executive order today. If it's like the draft that I had seen previously, we're likely to see a legal challenge to the suspension of visas to people from non-citizens from 6 nations predominantly populated by Muslims. We're likely to see a legal challenge to sort of a suspension of the refugee admissions program generally for 4 months. The claims could be a variety under domestic and international law. I think one that's very likely to be seen is what part of the executive order that's not being focused on so much is the statements about detention and increasing the use of detention in terms of immigration enforcement. That's something the Obama administration did quite a lot, particularly with respect to responses to Central American asylum applicants coming to the country. President Trump has said that previously that he's going to end what he referred to as catch and release. I thought that was a fly fishing reference, but apparently it's his reference to releasing immigrants pending on bond pending the removal proceedings, and he's talked about increasing the numbers of building detention facilities along the U.S.-Mexico border region. Detention class actions have been brought for literally generations. There's one currently before the Supreme Court challenging immigrant detention that's been argued and will be decided later in the spring. And I think that you're likely to see many challenges to immigrant detention. I mean, you could see other challenges depending how, sort of the sanctuary things are enforced and a variety of other things, but those are the ones that just naturally jump to mind.
Just say a bit more on when you said, say the suspensions of visas by country. Would that be seen as overreaching what Congress has put into law by by creating an extra set of barriers? How would that work?
There's, in the special registration program that was put into place by the Bush administration, there were a number of challenges to those provisions, and that required people from a group of nations, predominantly populated by Muslims, who were between the ages of 18 and 34 and were men, and in this country on particular kinds of visas. And those were challenged on equal protection grounds under the 5th and 14th Amendments. Some lower courts upheld the special registration program and remained in effect until the last month of Obama's presidency. The Supreme Court hasn't addressed that kind of equal protection challenge, and you notice that the candidate Trump was talking about blocking all Muslim migration, and I think he came up with a little bit of a more sophisticated approach. Well, we won't talk about Muslims, but we'll talk about nations that harbor terrorism. And so he just happens to list all Muslims. But in any event, I think we could see a challenge, something like that, going all the way to the Supreme Court. The reason I think the refugee provisions might cause particular concern is that there's a suspension. If the final is like the draft, there's a suspension of the refugee admission program for 4 months. And under international law, we're supposed to, give safe haven to refugees if they can establish their claims. And putting it off for 4 months may well violate international law.
Okay, next, I'm going to turn to Ali to kick off some initial remarks. In terms of, in addition to the kind of civil society kind of stuff that you're talking about, Ali, just thinking in terms of the more kind of standard kind of legislative lobbying efforts and maybe even administrative lobbying efforts, what do you see happening in the next few years?
Well, one of the biggest reasons that Republicans would always tell us they didn't vote for immigration reform is that they would not get political credit. Well, for the foreseeable future, Republicans get full and fair credit for everything immigration related. So in a state like, California, your typical blue states, most all of your congressional Republicans are either good on the issue of immigration reform or at least moderate. The question will be, will the rest of the Republican Party, take advantage of this opportunity, or will they continue their strategy of really doubling down on enforcement and pretty much following the template that the Trump administration has set the first week? I think it's a little bit too early to tell which direction it will be. So 3 days ago, there's a article in the Wall Street Journal talking about Senator Thom Tillis. Tillis is a first-term Republican senator. He was the Speaker of the House in North Carolina when they made an effort to grant driver's licenses to the undocumented. But he is seen as a legitimate conservative within the Republican Party. He's not kind of a, John McCain and a Lindsey Graham are great on this issue, but it's almost like they're too good on this issue. So somebody like Thom Tillis, like Senator Tillis, gives me a sense of, okay, well, maybe there is some sort of a change occurring within the party. He's been appointed vice chair of the Immigration Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. John Cornyn, the Majority Whip from Texas, is the chair of that committee. Cornyn has always kind of danced around this issue, but maybe between Cornyn and Tillis on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, Sessions at Justice, kind of out of their hair, maybe they have a little bit more space. Tillis is talking about kind of a three bill package that balances kind of carrot and stick approach between some version of legalization with some versions of enforcement. On the House side, I think you've got a much better speaker in Paul Ryan. I think he cares about this issue more than John Boehner did. I think he plays the game better than John Boehner did. Whether or not he can, pressure Chairman Goodlatte of the Judiciary Committee from above and rank and file pressure Goodlatte from below to unstick some measures in the House, I think is a tough slog, because the House Judiciary Committee is still a very, very tough group for us. It has the likes of Steve King and company. So what does that all mean? Kind of going back to what I opened this with is that, again, Republicans have, they get full and fair credit for everything, which is an opportunity for us. How does in this particular region of the state, how is Congressman Denham engaged? How is Valadao engaged? These are two moderate Republicans whose districts are changing incredibly fast. So there's a political element to their interest in immigration reform, and therefore there's a political pressure that they can carry back to Speaker Ryan and the rest of the leadership team. So I think that, we're obviously in a very different environment than what we expected going into the election, but the challenge remains the same in terms of really making a cultural and a political case to Republicans so that they see the value to them and to their Republican constituents for moving forward on immigration reforms.
Okay. Although I would say in some ways, maybe last time the Republicans could have taken full credit was 2004-06, but there was a rebellion within the party.
Right, and that's, clearly Trump is the rebellion within the party at this point. And we can either look at this as the world is ending, and we have to play defense and try to stop everything that we can. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at it that way. But there's also an element that, the best defense is a good offense. So I think we have to balance our efforts to block the things that are happening with efforts to move things constructively, because as long as there's a debate within the Republican Party about which direction to go on this issue, the stronger our defense is.
Okay, one thing I'll follow up as an additional caveat before I jump to Celeste and Stephen to talk about social movements. And this I would ask both of Ali and Dean Johnson is thinking about the state picture, right? So I and a few others have been pushing for a while to say, let's not discount the role for states to engage more robustly on immigration law. I wonder what your opinions are, given the current federal climate, whether we should kind of not necessarily throw in the towel, but at least engage in a series of parallel state efforts to whatever's happening federally.
I'm sorry, dude. I would say that absolutely. I think the more that gets done in the states, the better. But I think, this is a tough thing to say to a room of Californians. The rest of the country is not California. So I think it's very important that what happens in California, what is said in California, and the leadership role that California plays is, as much as possible, having a positive impact on the lives of immigrants who are living in much, much more difficult states. It's great that California is doing all these amazing things, but you visit folks in Oklahoma, the Southeast, the Midwest, their life is completely different, and their lawmakers interpret what California does and says, we are going to do the exact opposite. So I just think we have to be strategic in the language that we're using, and the strategies, so that we're gonna do everything we can in every state possible. But California does play a very unique role.
I don't disagree with any of that. I think it's important to be strategic and be smart. At the same time, at the state level right now, and the local level in many jurisdictions in the state, there's an incredible opportunity. I had the opportunity the other day to watch Governor Brown's State of the State speech and attend the swearing-in of Attorney General Becerra. And there's an incredible amount of energy in Sacramento. Some people said that they thought Jerry Brown gave the most impassioned speech he's ever given in his political career when he was talking about immigrants. And I think that we should take that to heart and do what we can to help residents of our state. There's a number of bills that I guess I'll be testifying on in the next few weeks involving due process rights of immigrants, possibly creating a fund to provide legal representation to immigrants, including in removal proceedings and the rest. I would not say that we should not do what we can for our residents because they might not like it in Alabama, but I do think that we should do what we can in these circumstances.
Okay, and then finally, we're going to talk about social movements. Celeste, one thing you talked about was what you gave the example of the women's marches from, I guess it was just last weekend. Yeah, like a lot has changed within a week. And I kind of almost tongue-in-cheek on social media kind of posted that I would love to see all that energy from that past weekend come out in defense of immigrant rights. And I mean, granted, it was like drinking out of a fire hose this week in terms of all of the different awful, well, okay. all the different policies. I won't editorialize too much that were coming down. But I'll just put it bluntly: can we expect white feminists to stand up for immigrant rights?
That's a great question. I'm actually working on like a book on kind of on that issue, but I think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Like there's a lot of promising aspects in terms of social movements. We see that mobilization begets mobilization, right? That we've seen a lot of really strong movements like the anti-gender violence movement and the undocumented movement and Black Lives Matter movement, and these have been really great movements, but and within those movements, a lot of them have focused on intersectionality and coalition building, and there have been a lot of lessons learned there. But there are a lot of people who are being mobilized for the first time and have a lot to learn in terms of how do you build coalitions. And I've been torn about this a lot, like as somebody who's really has these values of inclusivity and knows the ways in which these different movements are connected, but then also who's a big pragmatist who teaches at a university that's predominantly white. I have a lot of classes that I teach, Intro to Women and Gender Studies, that are a lot of young white women who are coming and very well-intentioned, but still a lot to learn in terms of the way in which they might see issues other than their own being connected, seeing the ways in which different forms of oppression connect. And I think that there's a lot of bridge building that needs to be done, which is going to require a little bit of patience on the part of the movements that are a lot more advanced in terms of their thinkings of intersectionality, but also in terms of a lot of self-reflexivity on the part of white women who are in positions of advantage. But what I'd like to say is intersectionality, I think, pushes us to move beyond these simplifications, right? That there's been a lot of blame levied against white women, right? 54% of white women voted for Trump, but remember that 46% of them did not, and that we need to move beyond also just these simplistic notions of race and gender to also think about class and other experiences. And one of the big things about social movements is trying to find the points of commonality while still acknowledging difference, right? That this is what actually builds coalitions, is moving on between simplistic notions of universality, like the sisterhood, right? That's what the feminist movement has often been kind of complained of, like prematurely announcing that we have this global citizen, our sisterhood that goes beyond. But that really the way in which you keep movements together is to say, yes, we have these things that are common, but we're all coming from very different places and acknowledging that sort of difference, right? That was part of the problem with the Occupy movement, right? The Occupy movement came in from the entry of class, right? So class is the big issue, and we see this with the Bernie Sanders movement as well, is that class is the big thing that can pull us all together, right? The 1% versus the 99%, but that 99% is really diverse, and how they experience class inequality is very different. And so the challenge is doing both, is let's still keep this message that's pulling us together, but at the same time, can we acknowledge those differences in a way that makes everybody feel like their concerns are being heard? So I know it's a really long answer to like, are white women going to I don't want to generalize in terms of that. I think there's a lot of work to be done in a lot of different directions on that one.
Okay, thanks. And then for Stephen, I'm going to pose a question that I initially had as a theme in a sharper way too. There was this big piece that made a splash after the election by, I forget what discipline this person was. I think was it a Columbia professor, NYU professor, basically saying we've gone too far into identity politics, and it's time to basically do class politics again. And there's a lot of so there's basically been this huge push to basically start moving towards class politics and not do so much of this identity stuff. So where do you see not just Latino social movements and politics, but just more broadly kind of people of color and immigrant politics faring with this kind of resistance?
It's really hard because even within the media, everything centrals around white neutrality, right? As whiteness as the neutral, normal sort of center of objectivity. And any deviation from that equals, Sotomayor, Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor she said, well, my history, my identity influences my decisions, and immediately many, white men say like, well, see, she's biased, as if one's whiteness doesn't also influence their decisions, and just because they don't admit it doesn't mean it isn't so. But, this notion of identity politics is, again, one of the reasons why white progressives get the flack that white feminists get, right, is this notion that class politics necessarily excludes or necessarily includes racial politics to the extent that we don't have to talk about it. And so, part of this movement, this was, I think, justifiably so, one of the complaints that many people of race had with President Obama was the notion that, well, if I just nominate a progressive white guy for the Supreme Court, all of these problems are going to go away. And we saw pretty quickly that Republicans recognize the ideology of whitelist pretty clearly, right? And they basically didn't vote for the Supreme Court justice for 9 months, hijacking a Supreme Court seat. And a lot of that was based on President Obama, very explicitly playing identity politics, right? It's not, if you had nominated an African-American woman to the Supreme Court justice, we would still not have a Supreme Court justice, but I think it would have changed the narrative of who is qualified to be a Supreme Court justice. And, I and many people were very critical of that move. But, rather than saying, we want to go away from identity politics, I think we need more discussion about identity politics and how our identities influence our biases, our conclusions, our analysis. We often assume, even when it comes to numbers, if you're an economist, and not to offend the economists here, but we generally kind of even see numbers as a male thing, right? And by male meaning they're neutral. There is no bias in numbers. And so we see even like at Google or Amazon that programmers actually have biases. There's inherent biases, racial and gendered, in the actual programming. And so again, just rather than ignoring identity politics, I think we need to double down on identity politics.
Okay, Celeste, one thing to add, and I have one final question to throw out to anyone on the panel, and then we'll move to Anna and then the rest.
Well, one of the things to kind of recognize in terms of identity politics, like when they, in the past they've been accused of dividing movements, right? Like that there's a labor movement or even the Occupy movement, and then it gets fragmented. The only reason you start to see that separate organizing occur is when there is oppression that's within the movement, right? When certain groups are being excluded from the leadership, from their issues are not being represented within that. And so identity politics is actually a symptom of an uninclusive movement. And that needs to be acknowledged. Now, yes, what happens after that when there starts being the separate organizing, that can lead to a fragmented movement, but it doesn't necessarily have to. The movement can adopt and respond and start to incorporate those things in a way that builds a stronger solidarity. And so when we stop kind of blaming identity politics and instead blaming non-inclusivity as being the reason why that identity politics emerges in the first place, then we might get a little bit closer to having a solution and a stronger movement.
It's really interesting. So maybe I don't know if this captures what you said, that maybe it's a symptom of movement failure rather than the cause of movement failure, the way many people are. Okay, awesome. The question I want to throw out to the group for anyone who wants to take it, it builds in some ways on what Giovanni was saying, what Stephen was saying earlier. We had a forum at UCR School of Public Policy, the few days after the election, just trying to help make sense of what's going on. And one of the faculty members said, it's really important to have, good, solid research and policy and to really engage. I said, really? Is that the lesson we take from this? Because it's what we're seeing is, I mean, forget about alternative facts, is we have executive orders being released without seemingly that much research, legal research or social science research underpinning it. I talked to someone who, it's an acquaintance, not a friend, but still, who was helping out the transition team, and what he told me was that it's great, like you can write a 2-page white paper and it'll get read in ways that might not have gotten read before, because so many people, including so many Republicans, had said never Trump, and so they did not have access. So there's like a whole bunch of people just throwing pasta to the wall to see like what'll fly politically, and who knows what else, in terms of actual policy. So given that climate, I mean, what role can social science research credibly play in terms of influencing what happens in the next few years?
So I'm going to take it for shot here because I come from the right country to answer this. So, I mean, in historical perspective, one of the reasons that attracted me in being a social scientist and an economist in the United States is how the U.S. as a tradition, maybe Britain had also, and there too, of doing policies, having some serious consulting and some serious input from research, facts, and in part academia as well. Council of Economic Advisor of the President is often being staffed by people I think are very good and smart academics, and they have been playing a role. And my experience, actually, even in the immigration area, which is very contentious, was that my small contacts with policy people in DC or a group were of people who were genuinely interested in understanding the facts and what research says, because that's one of the input that goes in there. So I hope this is a temporary deviation from that, but I certainly have observed a deviation in the direction which has been very dominant in many other countries, and Europe was mentioned. So social scientists in Italy couldn't do much for a long time, but I think there has been, I guess the closest situation to this is when Berlusconi was elected, and academic and a lot of people, social scientists, felt like they were completely ousted and they didn't have a voice. And I think nothing happened until there was an organized alternative around a reasonable policy way, and they continue to do research. Eventually, this has become relevant again. I think that the current government, Renzi, is much more reasonable. And so I think what can we do? We can continue doing what we do. I have a little frustration right now, I have to say, and I don't know, maybe some people will take the lesson that we should do much more, we should do much differently, not do research, but do more active activists. I think that research is very important, and I think in the long run, these things are not going to go away. Immigration, right migration policies, migration pressure are going to be around in the US and in the world, and we need to understand them, and to manage them well, we need to understand them well. And so I stand for this type of approach, which in the short run seems to be a little bit in the shade now. I still am confident.
As a part of an organization that consumes a lot of research and then tries to apply it to policy, one of the most frustrating conversations I've ever had with a group of researchers was when they said, we're non-partial. We are nonpartisan. We are, we just do the research and you do with it what you will. I think those days are over. And I'm not saying that academics should be taking a political position, but I think that academics, particularly in the social science arena, need to be really effective communicators of their findings. And I think that there are, even for us, we haven't even gotten to the tip of the iceberg in terms of the way to communicate these issues to the public. And everybody up here from an academic perspective, I've seen their stuff quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, but I'm not a normal person who lives in a community who's working every day on, trying to put food on the table, et cetera. So how do we take this great work and translate it to the person on the ground who is really struggling with these issues? And I just think that requires a different mindset from the research community, not necessarily in terms of the research, but in the communication of the research.
So you already took over, I think, the preponderance of good questions. But I do want to say one thing about this issue of the social sciences, because I am a social scientist and I also do interdisciplinary work. In part to respond to Ali, which is those of us who do race and gender politics have long been committed to this idea that there is no objectivity, that we don't get to pretend to be passive in the process, and that entire disciplinary niche is really about pushing back against that presumption of objectivity that's actually advancing of a non-objective standards. But I do want to say with regard to social sciences, that we're not talking about having to produce knowledge that's necessarily going to convince everybody, right? That when we look statistically about where there is resistance, it's really a very small segment statistically of the population that doesn't want to hear any empirical reality, that is going to believe whatever they believe regardless of whatever empirical reality put on in them. There is a larger segment of the population that is movable, that can be altered, and for whom there's some really great studies. Jeff Guo just did a piece in the Washington Post that was really excellent about some of these sociological studies where people presented with a empirical reality about immigrants, namely the low levels of crime, the financial contributions, are apt to actually change their minds, not only change their positions on immigration, but then to be willing to advance more liberal policies on immigration. So it's not so much, I think, that I have to, as a social scientist, back out and say it's just for naught. I'm not going to be able to convince anybody, nor do I have to say I need to save everyone. I'm not necessarily, my goal is not to convince the world. My goal is to find where I can move people and where there are, where is this mushy middle that you can actually alter people's political positions. But having said that, one of the things I'm deeply concerned about here with immigration is the fact that these policies, which are restrictive on a scale that we really haven't seen before, are portending even greater levels of detention, certainly deportation and encumbering on immigrants, are not being dropped into an immigration situation where we have any sense of normalcy. That is to say, when we think about immigration politics on a scale from highly restrictive to highly liberal, we've already hit the high water mark on highly restrictive, and we've done so decades ago, right? We have been operating under a very restrictive regime for over 30 years. So we're already at the far end of the scale, and now we are engaged in a debate on how much further we can go. And that's, to me, incredibly troubling, not only for how much that's going to impact an already vulnerable population, but how politically we respond. Because it does feel like we are in a moment where all we can do is play defense, and that the prospects of getting back to a debate about comprehensive reform is completely off the table. That's not even in the ether. It's also the case that we're not only talking about immigration reform. This is an entire presidency who came to power by proffering a debate on national belonging, on who gets to claim Americanness, who gets to belong, and putting forth a white nationalist agenda as the clear national identity, right? So in that context, the question I have is, following on the previous panel, how do we respond effectively to this? And is any form of collaboration in this particular moment? Is there any way we can, in fact, create bipartisan legislation, allow for certain nominees to go forward, create bipartisan commissions without giving this president and the entire white nationalist agenda political capital that then can be used against further restrictions on vulnerable populations? In other words, if he passes bipartisan legislation, doesn't he just gain political capacity that then gets utilized against these immigrant communities?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think certainly on infrastructure bills, that's one of the big questions that Democrats have to grapple with. On immigration, I'm curious to hear kind of the answer to that. I was just talking to someone from a DC kind of think tank earlier today. I thought the Bridge Act actually seemed like it had a shot. This is to basically legislatively extend DACA. But this person thought that it had no chance in the House. that even if the Senate did something bipartisan, that it'd be really hard to get it through the House. Ali, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or others in terms of, I mean, yes, there's a risk of even getting credit for something like that, but even if something like that is even viable in the next couple of years.
So I think we're a long way away from bipartisan legislation moving through a process and on a track to the president's desk. And by a long way off, I mean it could be anywhere from 6 months to the next administration. I just don't think we know. You know, I spent the last year, this is the closest I'm going to get to being an academic, writing a book that comes out in April. And the book is titled, There Goes the Neighborhood. And in the book, what I did is I interviewed about 60 folks across the country that we've been working with over the last few years who are conservative and moderate faith law enforcement and business leaders, and spent days digging into South Carolina, suburban Houston, Utah, the Midwest, to get a better understanding of why does a conservative Southern Baptist pastor care about these issues? Why does a Republican Attorney General from Indiana care about these issues? Why does a farmer from Eastern Washington, Idaho, care about these issues? And it's it kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier, is that for them who are ensconced in this issue on a day-to-day basis, it's not about the policy outcome in DC, it's not about the politics back and forth, left and right. It's about the way their communities are changing and the common set of values that they can find with these new communities. So when I get this, kind of at this time where we're kind of trying to figure out what legislation is possible, the only legislation that's possible is the one, at this point in time, is the one that says, is the one that allows conservative, moderate, and liberal folks in, frankly, Republican districts to say, I agree on that. And they're not going to agree on that piece of legislation immediately, but they will agree on a common set of values and the way their community's culture is changing.
I think the question I would have is, and a bit to play devil's advocate here, I mean, why not pull a Mitch McConnell, right? Why not say, in this moment, any success of this administration will be turned on us, will be used to further legitimate what is a clearly restrictive agenda. Why not wait it out for 18 months at the very least, hoping some midterm hoping against hope, some midterm success? But why not use an agenda that's been effectively used against the left for the same purpose?
Okay, in the interest of time, we'll quickly answer that if anyone wants. I mean, you can take that and then we'll take that.
Because I just believe that there's a large swath of Americans in the middle of the country who want to see things get done, and they are politically sophisticated enough to see who is actually pushing for those solutions. And if it's a combination of Democrats and Republicans, it will drive the Trump administration crazy. And that at the end of the day, if he is forced to sign that bill and somebody's life improves, I'm going to pick somebody's life over a short-term political battle.
So this might be too far into the future, but I'm going to take advantage of your expertise and put it out there. So Trump has threatened to withhold all federal funding for sanctuary cities, which is unprecedented. And I'd like to know a little bit about potential court, how this will be handled in the court potentially, and its implication for domestic social policy. And the reason why I'm asking that is because so much of social policy is designed around providing, using federal funding as a sort of a carrot to get to expand the role of federal government in social policy. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or I would love to hear them.
I'm going to suggest Kevin be the first person to take that. Are you the only lawyer here, or are we?
I don't play one at all. I don't read the executive order on sanctuary cities to go as far as you suggest. I don't think, it basically says we're going to strip funding if state and local governments violate particular provisions of the, United States Code with respect to sharing information that you've already collected. And I think there's actually even a waiver for that under the Attorney General's provision. It doesn't say what kind of funds will be withheld. It doesn't give you an idea of the breadth or the narrowness of the funds. And to me, any legal challenge is going to rest in part on what, in fact, is implemented and how it's implemented. And as I was trying to allude to in my remarks in an articulate way, I think that whole discussion of sanctuary cities is really more fire and brimstone than reality in terms of what's going to happen. So I do think, and I think this on a number of these areas, we have to wait and see how it's implemented, and then see what challenges might be made. And I think actually the commandeering of state and local governments is much more likely to take place when it comes to sharing law enforcement information than when it comes to other areas. But I think we have to wait and see how it goes. And I don't think we should be alarmist in our approach. It's actually very odd because I'm usually the pessimistic one, but I'm glad that DACA still survives. I'm glad that the talk of dismantling it has been relatively, I'm not saying it would be good to dismantle it because I don't think that, but it'd be, as opposed to getting rid of it on day one, it's talking about phasing it out more slowly. So I tend to think that some things you just have to wait and see how they are rolled out.
Can I add, this is on more the economic public policy side of what you said. So I think one effect it will have, which has nothing to do with the legal, is that there is a lot of research that shows that the intensity of enforcement, because it has an impact on how much the community of undocumented take advantages of some of the mean-tested or welfare benefits that they are entitled to, could actually decrease and put some of this community who are in poverty in worse state. An example are the access to SNAP, to food stamps for a family who have a child who's born in the United States, but they are undocumented. They have an undocumented leader. There is a lot of research that shows that in states where enforcement has been tougher, families have been much more reticent to give information in order to receive these welfare programs. And there are several to which children in particular would qualify, and that are going to be, these families are going to withdraw because they're going to be much more awarded. So while I think an immediate impact will be that on, a lot of work hunkering down. I was talking to some employer, they also will think that a lot of people who are currently employed are gonna try to keep the current job at all costs without upgrading, modifying, asking for anything else, for the fear that any change in status will signal them. So a lot of stagnation and hunkering down will happen in the community, which I think will have an economic impact on those and on the kids of some of these families.
Okay, any other questions in the audience?
This is for Kevin, and maybe Phil and Giovanni can chime in on this, or anyone, I guess. Kevin, you've written extensively on the 1965 INA, in terms of how it's sort of put a stranglehold on documentation availability, especially to Mexicans. In the Trump administration, do you see or forecast sort of any changes to like the 7% rule or just visa or documentation availability to sort of low-skilled labor? I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to follow it up because just of how much you've talked about the 1965 Act and its perennial relevance. Thanks.
And one thing I want to add to that, in one of the debates, Trump talked about sunsetting the INA, right? Like other laws that sunset and not just have that frozen in place. Any chance that is going to go anywhere?
I would like to see the INA go into the sunset. It was an act passed in 1952. It's been amended pretty regularly over the last, several decades, 70 years almost. It was sort of fortunate in Cold War times, and the whole design was to keep people out of the country. It was amended in part by the 65 Act. It's created tremendous backlogs in visas for people from particular countries, especially Mexico, China, and India, but also the Philippines as well. And to just give you an example of the backlogs, I worked on a case a few years ago, Sergio Garcia, an undocumented immigrant who we successfully argued should be licensed to practice law in this state. He applied for a visa in 1994 He was eligible for it because his parents had naturalized. And as of 2014, when the California Supreme Court decided the case, he was still waiting in line for his visa because the backlogs for people from Mexico were so lengthy. Do I think that Donald Trump's going to support some kind of legislation that would get rid of the visa backlog? I don't see that. And I don't see, I mean, that was part of some of the comprehensive immigration reform proposals. So I don't see that some of those problems going away. I do think sort of the issue that, in thinking about immigration reform in this way, it takes me back to what Anna was talking about. I think in terms of comprehensive immigration reform, there were some people who couldn't support some of the bills that were passed because they thought they were still too tough and too enforcement-oriented. And for me, I think in the future, in thinking about immigration reform and proposals by Republicans or not, I'd always look at the particular proposal and try to figure out whether I thought the benefits outweighed the costs and try to do that kind of calculus, because there's a lot of costs doing nothing.
The Barbara Jordan Commission tackled this issue of backlogs and visas and stuff. And their recommendation, of course, was not accepted, but it was to drop those preferences for adult brothers and sisters and speed up family unification for second preference immigrants. Now, that was rejected. They also went on to say, if you set a ceiling and want to do trade-offs within that ceiling, their thing was treat immigrants, treat legal immigrants as intending Americans and make them eligible for welfare benefits, but don't take as many needy immigrants. That was another recommendation. So what happened in Congress? Well, they decided keep everybody coming in, cut them all off or cut off the access to benefits. So there's no easy answer to these kinds of trade-offs. But when I think that Jordan Commission was a reasonably serious effort to deal with it, it did not win political acceptance. I don't know whether there will be any more. I mean, on the guest worker draft executive order, they were ordering studies of everything. So whether there will be serious studies that lead to anything is hard to tell.
I'll weigh in here with some of my research in this area, and I'll actually push back a bit on what Phil had said earlier, and even Kevin, you were maybe hinting at a bit here, which is progressives on immigrants, they ultimately will take whatever is put on their plate. So when it's larded up with all this enforcement stuff, they will protest. Maybe people like Bernie Sanders will actually vote against a bill because they object to some of those provisions. But the biggest hurdle to CIR has never been from the left wanting to water down the enforcement stuff, right? When we saw that in 2006 and 2007, there was a lot of bitter medicine that the left was willing to swallow to get that passed. And even the Senate bill in 2013 contained a lot of enforcement stuff that people on the left were not happy with. But one thing I think maybe, this is something provocative. I had an op-ed all ready to go the week before the election. I was like, okay, maybe this will no longer fly. But maybe it could fly, is this notion of piecemeal versus comprehensive. And that's just, it's been anathema on the left to agree to any kind of piecemeal because it's seen as not allowing for CIR. But I wonder, so the kind of provocative piece I was going to write is that California shows the political advantages of doing something piecemeal, where yes, you don't get everything, but you start building momentum, you start creating these coalitions that then can come back time and again to show that once you pass a policy, the sky's not going to fall. Things aren't going to go too crazy. Of course, there's always the risk that you'll do the easy stuff first and the difficult things might never get done. But the alternative is, say with something like the DREAM Act that didn't get passed in the lame duck session in 2010. Now that is something that progressives ultimately were willing to put aside and say, fine, we'll try piecemeal. But before that, they weren't willing to do the DREAM Act because they said we could get the whole thing.
But see, I don't think the issue is piecemeal versus comprehensive. I think the issue, I don't think the issue that has torpedoed immigration reform in the past has been legalization of the undocumented or enforcement. I think the issue that has always killed us has been future flow. What does the future of the immigration system look like? Because that's when the coalitions, the legislative coalitions, get really funky really quickly. Because you have parts of labor who all of a sudden are teaming up with parts of the Republican or the conservative community and saying, no, we're not going to do this. But then you have other Republicans siding with parts of the Democratic community saying, no, we want more visas. That's, in 2013-14, that was the toughest part of the bill to negotiate in the Senate, and that was a big part of what gummed up in the House. When you go back to 2006 and 7, I mean, everything else was resolved, but the future flow question is what always killed us. And Trump may yell the most about, the wall and legalization, but when he talks about, when he talked about eliminating the 1965 INA, he was talking about future flow of immigrants. So that's why I think a big part of this debate remains this cultural component of, okay, how is the country changing, how are cities changing, how are towns changing, and how do you deal with that? Because people love Jose next door, they love Fatima next door, but the Jose across the country, that's the one that they're worried about. So I just think that's been the issue.
Okay, I'll push back a bit on that, Ali. Yeah, exactly. My recollection of why reform failed in the House was not any kind of policy debate. It's Republican lawmakers facing primary voters and getting their butt kicked, especially Eric Cantor, right? And so that's where I wonder, ultimately, I mean, the Senate, Senate is a place where you can have these kind of policy debates still, even in an age of pretty deep partisan divides. But in the House, I don't know how many House primary challengers or Republican activists in House districts were debating the minutia of future flows. I think they saw immigration as a litmus test issue, and if you were going to be wobbly on that they would take you out.
Right, and why were they angry about it? They were angry because they thought more immigrants were going to come to their community as a result of reform. And that's why future flow is the sticking point, is that until there is an active debate within conservative circles of, one part of that activist community saying, no, we want more, we believe in the value of immigrants and immigration, until we have that debate, yeah, this is a lot harder. But it has less to do with legalization or enforcement. It has much more to do with kind of what does the future of that district look like.
Okay, so you mean not just the kinds of immigrants, but where they will settle and what kind of social impact they'll have. Exactly. Yes, back there.
I have a question for the social movement professors. I feel like this is, as we have seen with the marches, a great opportunity for the building of social movements. And I guess my question is that a threat for political parties, or is that going to help rebuild the political parties on, I guess in this case, in the Democratic side, but even on the Republican side as well?
I think that's an important question in terms of that connection. There's definitely, just to look at the first part of that, like there is this moment for growth that's going on right now, right? That in terms of everything we know about social movements, there's a lot of things that are look favorable, right? Cycles of protest, mobilization begets mobilization. People that feel like their rights are being taken away. A lot of political education that makes more easily mobilize. Networks easier to mobilize, right? That there's a lot that we can tend to see that. But my big worry right now is that some of the movements and some of the social movement theories also talk about how there's this kind of individual calculus that people have in terms of mobilization, in which people mobilize when they think that the risk of change is that there's a good chance that they're going to be successful in terms of that mobilization, and that the risk is low. And in that way, political opportunities sometimes work in the opposite of what you anticipate. I think part of the reason the Occupy movement happened when it did and was able to sustain as long as it did was because there wasn't quite the level of suppression that I think we can actually anticipate under the Trump administration, right? And this is my big fear, is that we've already seen the regulating of protest and free speech, right? That you have to have these permits, that you have, that you have to follow these rules, that there have to be these different processes, that there's, right now in the States, there's all this criminalization of protest, right? That's going on. And I think that that's going to be a bit of a deterrent, and that, I think that there are going to be a lot of people who are motivated to protest early on. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in terms of the suppression, because it hasn't, there was this gendered aspect and racialized aspect of the Women's March, right, where that there wasn't the suppression, right, because there was, even though it wasn't just white women that were marching, it was viewed as that, and that provides some element of protection. And with the scientists, I don't necessarily see them as being seen as being threatened, but as these mobilizations start to take on issues like immigrant rights, that I think that's when we're going to start seeing some police suppression happening with the mobilization as they expand to issues that are racialized, that's where we're going to see it. And this is important to think about how, sometimes protests happen in places where they're allowed to happen and not where they're suppressed. So then the other part of that component is, how does that then translate, right, into the institutions, right? How does that, how might that build the Democratic Party? And that's a harder question, right? It's a little bit harder to do that, and especially in terms of on the left, right? On the left, there's a mix. There's the reformists and the revolutionaries, and the revolutionaries don't see the state as being a place to make change. And so there are a lot of people who are willing to protest outside the state, but not within the institutions. And so it's harder sometimes to recruit from the left, because there are those people who are dismissing that as being any means of change. But it's also a good time to recruit new talent, right? That there are some people who have more moderate positions who are starting to think like, okay, wait a second, maybe I don't have to be as qualified as I thought to run for office, and that I'm upset enough to know that I want to make a change in that way. And so there are some opportunities, but they're not necessarily going to be easy. And I don't necessarily see a lot of traction that the Democrats, they still seem a little bit disorganized in terms of formulating their resistance. And so that's a little bit worrisome, right? Because the mobilization for the 2018 elections needs to start yesterday, right? and it's not clear that there is an outline for that.
Okay, before we go to Stephen, so we are running out of time. So Stephen, I'll actually say, I don't know if you were intending to maybe address this as part of your last minute of commentary. We're going to have 1 minute each. We'll start with Stephen and then come down here and end.
Going back to what Anna had said, it's
1 minute, Stephen.
I think it's important to learn some lessons from what the Republican Party has done, and that is, on the one hand, you want to be accommodating, you want to compromise, but on the other hand, when you're trying to build a movement, you want to have leaders that are willing to fight for you. And when you have leaders that are compromising your interests, it's hard to convince them to come out and to vote and to participate and to register. And the Republicans did this really well with the Tea Party. There was a lot of churning within the Republican Party. People that weren't believers were replaced with believers, right? And so people individually lost their seats, but they were replaced with people who were willing to fight for the Republican Party. And so I think part of that is the discussion going on with the Republican Party, with the Democratic Party today, is do we compromise or do we fight? I tend to be on the fight side, because I think if you want to be inspired to be mobilized, you need someone willing to take a punch for you. And even if it means that person falls, somebody else stronger or more committed to the movement will rise. And there's a couple of tests.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off.
All right, look at down in Xavier Becerra's district and see how that turns out, because he's being replaced. And there's a couple of progressives and
Okay, compromise or fight. Those would be, I can almost preview what Phil's going to say. But anyway, so next, Celeste. What happens? Is it 1 minute? No, your final minute of whatever you want to do.
I don't know. Just that, I think that there's a lot of work that's ahead in terms of it, that and that we're going to need to get creative in terms of some of the solutions, right? That really, when we see social movements being the most successful is when they have insider and outsider strategies, when they're not just that we think about that there's a role for the revolutionaries and there's a role for the reformists, and that we need to try to not eat our own in terms of that. Like, that coalitions hurt, they're painful, they're not supposed to be easy. If coalitions, if it feels like it's easy, then you're probably not doing the work that you need to do for it, and that we have to pace ourselves in terms of, it's going to be a marathon. It's going to be a long 4 years, I know that I've been, in terms of trying to promote a little bit of self-care and listen to those messages in terms of knowing that there has to be some time to take a break so that you have the energy to continue the fight, so.
Great. Ali.
So there are three things that we're trying to do as an organization. One is that as individuals, we can feel angry and frustrated, but we can't be angry and frustrated. Second, we have to challenge our assumptions at every step of the way in terms of whether we're working with new allies or existing allies. And third, our kind of unofficial motto as an organization is to meet people where they are, but don't leave them there.
So to end on a little bit of a positive note, I think this week we've been overwhelmed by the sequence of this executive order, but I really think we need to wait a little bit. This executive order need to go down the agencies, and then through the agencies they're going to go through enforcement, and then to the state and the community. So we really are going to be there watching the numbers and what this really means and the facts. And I think we should gather a couple of years to see what really this has accomplished and how bad things are.
In that vein, the government is sort of like a supertanker. It's really hard to turn it around. At most, you push it a few degrees. But I think the single most important thing is this idea that, above all, in trying to come up to some sort of workable solutions, don't make it worse. The president has a lot more power on trade than he does on migration. On trade, the president can actually impose tariffs. The president can actually do a whole lot of things where the evidence, the economic evidence, is even stronger of what the benefits are. And so in trying to figure out which way forward, I mean, the big danger is in not allowing things to get way out of hand, which hopefully won't happen with that supertanker government, but could.
I'll just make 2 points. One, I think one of the good things that's been happening is that we're having conversations like this and how we might deal with immigration in the future. I think in the Obama administration early on, people thought, well, good things are going to happen because he had a good platform, he's good people surrounding him, and we got what we got, which was, record levels of deportations, record level of detentions, the harsh treatment of Central American immigrants and asylum seekers, and family detention, keeping families together but doing it in detention. So I think that, it's good that we're talking about these things now. To me, the thing that I'm most afraid with, I'm just a lawyer out in the country, is that, President Trump's going to be appointing people to the Supreme Court probably starting next week, and that's going to affect not just my immigration cases that go up there, and there's a lot, but also affirmative action, choice issues, criminal justice issues. In his first list of potential Supreme Court nominees was all white men. The second list had one woman, I think, and a few people of color. And I think that at least the people who were rumored as finalists, actually the best one is maybe a best in terms of progressive thinking. Is probably one is more libertarian than not, but the other ones are very, very conservative on a whole range of issues. So I think to me, what's going to happen in the Supreme Court is the thing that I think about, probably lose sleep more on than most other things.
I'll end on a slight note of optimism, too. One, I think that states can potentially play a role, not just on immigration, but other aspects of relating to vulnerable communities that we care about. And I think there's, certainly in California, but well beyond California, I think there's a lot of appetite for people to, including social scientists, to play a role where evidence can help inform policies. Another thing I would say is it's either optimism, but also shows what needs to be done. If you look at the gay rights movement, especially in terms of the right to marry, the future looked pretty bleak a couple of decades ago and even a decade ago. But what it took was sustained, coordinated, well-financed efforts, but also a lot of work in civil society. Something like immigration may be different from something like gay rights in a lot of ways, but clearly I would say on the role of how engaged should academics be, however they do in terms of their perceived neutrality or the kind of research they produce, this is not a spectator sport, right? Our involvement matters more now than ever. We might not always win in terms of having our perspectives help inform politics and policy, but the alternative of leaving the game because we get frustrated, I think is is far more dangerous because there are a lot more vulnerable populations that could suffer from our non-engagement. So hopefully, I mean, thanks to Brad for conceiving this idea way back, and I think it's turned out beautifully. But I don't know, Brad, if you wanted to say anything before we dismiss. Okay.
Thank Brad.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And thanks to you all for your engagement. And I think many of the speakers are going to be sticking around for a little bit, so feel free to come up and give your thoughts or share information. Thanks.